It's a surprise to me too, I said, picturing myself suddenly here with Holmes, waiting for some unknown assailant, as though we had never parted company and my rooms were just beyond the threshold of the divider. Irene Adler absent-mindedly picked up the key and twirled it in her hands as she spoke. James Carlyle, stepson to my late husband and stepson to me, swore revenge on me for having taken the considerable amount of the Carlyle estate. James Carlyle is a wicked man, Dr. Watson, cunning and clever, but a deadly individual. But surely this man, James Carlyle, was only spiteful because your husband had met his death, unfortunately, and he'd been swindled out of a fortune by... By me? Irene interrupted. Well, I was going to say by unfortunate circumstances. Irene Adler smiled. I'm not so young as I once was, Dr. Watson, and so I felt my life with Sir Joseph would be harmonious and as forever as one can expect to hope. We were happy. I was content, and wealth, with all its comfort, has always suited me. And then Sir Joseph died in a mysterious circumstance, I prodded. Yes, Irene said, quieter now.
Circumstances that were beyond your control,
Holmes said, turning towards us.
Sir Joseph did not die by accident. Is this correct, Miss Adler?
Miss Adler looked up and shook her head. No, she said simply.
I will tell you, Watson, what's happened, shall I?
Please, Holmes.
Sir Joseph was ill towards the end of his life. He was bedridden. One night, for some reason, he was on the stairs and he slipped, tumbled and broke his neck.
What on earth was he doing there?
I would surmise he heard a noise. Perhaps he felt someone was breaking into the house.
You are correct, Holmes, Miss Adler said. He was very nervous about security. After he'd been found, we noticed a small square window in the living room had been broken. He must have heard this and gone to investigate. He was always a very light sleeper. And you heard nothing, Miss Adler? I asked. I was asleep in my room further down the hallway. I sleep very well, Dr. Watson.
An inquest was held after James Carlyle pressed charges, accusing Lady Lola, Miss Adler, of pushing him to his death. The case was lost and Miss Adler came away with a considerable fortune. That much we know.
Holmes walked towards the fire and warmed his hands. The orange flicker from the flames gave his face an animated mask. As he spoke, he became grave as he pieced the facts together for my benefit.
It is a question of two wills, one made before Sir Joseph's marriage to Miss Adler and one afterwards. The will before left most of the estate and considerable wealth to his stepson, James Carlyle, and some small allowance to extended family and servants. The second will replaced James Carlyle's name with our very own Miss Adler's.
I see. So James Carlyle suspected foul play.
He suspected Miss Adler had her husband change his will and then accused her of pushing him down the stairs. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, Holmes.
I know Miss Adler has some, shall we say, interesting relations with the opposite sex and the fringes of the law. I know she would rather live her life in the darker shadows than light.
Holmes and Miss Adler fixed their eyes on each other, and I felt there was more being said underneath mere words.
But I would lay my life on the knowledge that Irene Adler isn't a murderer.
Thank you, Sherlock.
Rather a brute of a man and a wrong stepson fits the bill, eh, Watson?
Indeed, I would say so. But how, Holmes? What did happen to poor Sir Joseph?
Oh, it was simple, really, Watson. James Carlyle broke the window, waited for his stepfather at the top of the stairs, pushed him to his certain death, went back to his rooms. He was staying at that time, wasn't he, Miss Adler?
Oh, indeed. He and his wife, Mabel, they were in the rooms along from mine. I felt he knew something more than he was saying, and he showed little remorse at his stepfather's death. He was always an odious man, Dr. Watson, but he was the only relation to Sir Joseph, and I think he integrated himself with my husband.
Until you came along and pointed out one or two unpleasantries with his stepson.
Said Holmes. Yes, he turned on him. He saw it for himself. And then he made a new will, and your stepson somehow found out, I asked? Yes, somehow perhaps one of the servants. I was always the young upstart as far as they were concerned, and Carlyle ruled over them when he was there with fear and bullying. Perhaps one of them told him of Sir Joseph's new will.
And then?
Holmes said, leading her further into her narrative. James Carlyle arrived with a triumphant look upon his face. He locked himself away with my husband in the library, and there were raised voices. Finally, James left with a gleam of satisfaction in my direction. My husband was sitting at the table with a sheaf of papers. I knew as I walked towards him, and he looked at me, James had told him everything about my past. I see, I said. What a wicked thing to do. My past, my scarlet life when I knew you, Mr. Holmes,
Yes.
said Holmes, quietly absorbed. The idea being Sir Joseph would disown you and change his will back in favour of his stepson, I said. Yes, that was the idea. But that didn't happen. No, Dr. Watson. My husband forgave me. He loved me, Dr. Watson, and I loved him, in my way. So it was all to nothing. Yes, and James Carlyle was convinced his plan had worked, and so implemented the accident of my husband believing I would be blamed and he would have the estate because there was a new will. So imagine the shock when I was the benefactor still. He was furious. He accused me of disposing the new will. He felt sure he had convinced him to change his will again. And that I destroyed it in the fire. It was really most unpleasant.
His threats did not end in the courtroom, Miss Adler.
No, indeed. I've had a variety of incidents, Dr. Watson. My driver's car was damaged, so the brakes wouldn't work. We were lucky to escape unharmed. A fire came close to my bedroom quarters from the trees behind the house. I received many threatening letters, and loose brickwork from the roof came crashing down near me when I was on my regular walk around the grounds. All these accidents were put down to accidents, but you believe your stepson was behind them. I know, Dr. Watson. I do not scare easily. I am tough enough. But he intends to kill me, Dr. Watson. I am the only person between him and his stepfather's fortune. So, the older will, the one in his favour, was changed to favour you, and that one presumably destroyed.
Indeed, Watson, but a new will has been found.
Said Holmes. Found?
That's why there's a key here, and so too the will.
Holmes nodded at Irene, who opened her clutch bag and pulled out a long envelope with a seal. No, this is the will James Carlyle thought would be read at court. But I thought you said it was never made, said I. It wasn't, said Miss Adler.
It is a fiction, Watson. My own.
Sherlock came up with a rather brilliant idea, said Irene, handing the envelope to me.
James Carlyle wants to believe there's a new will. We will provide the evidence of his belief,
said Holmes. To what end?
James Carlyle is on his way here now. I told him by wire I managed to get the will from the safe through dubious means, and if he would part with some money, I would gladly hand it over. This is the actual key from Carlyle's safe. This is the very copy of which that he wishes to see.
Good gracious!
I told him the maid was a very good acquaintance of mine, and it would be beneficial to him to see the safe contents.
But surely, Holmes, if you don't mind me saying, he may have heard of you, especially if he's coming here to Baker Street.
You are forgetting, Watson, I no longer live here, and haven't for a long time. Mr. Jacobi does, and he has kindly agreed to lend his name to my correspondence.
I looked at Mr. Jacobi and began to wonder what a remarkable man he was, helping Holmes as he did without question.
I gather Mr. Carlyle is not a man of the world, and he may not have read your fictions or be aware of my previous abode. It's a risk we have to take. But I find when you lead a man to what he desires, greed takes place over reason.
Holmes said, crossing to the fire. At that moment, as if on cue, Jacobi grunted, and Holmes flew to the curtains and looked out.
He's here,
he said.
Miss Adler, if you please.
Miss Adler left the room and hid within my old bedroom. Jacobi turned off a lamp by the door, leaving the room in darkness, and Holmes stood by the great fire. We hid our revolvers within our jackets.
Now, Watson, I will do the talking. You and Jacobi remain out of sight.
What is it you're hoping for, Holmes? A confession with us as witnesses?
It would be nice if it came to that. I would like him to admit to killing a man in cold blood and then trying to implement his stepmother. I would like that very much indeed. But this man is dangerous, Watson. Be on your guard.
Holmes looked gravely at the door.
Time to hide, Watson. Here he comes. Your cap, if you please, Mr. Jacobi.
From my view through the crack of the door, I could see James Carlyle was a large man. On his large head was a sweep of rugged grey hair. His broad shoulders and long legs reminded me of a farmer having tended the land for many years, building up reserves of muscle and physique. He was imposing in the intimate room. He was smartly dressed, however, in a long coat and black trousers and gloves. Removing his hat, he looked suspiciously at the figure now seated by the fire. "You, Jacobi," he said sternly. Holmes nodded.
I am?
Holmes said quietly in a voice that wasn't quite his own. What's the idea, then? Carlyle said, looking quickly around. I'm a busy man, Jacobi. Too busy for games.
You received my wire, I see. You obviously know what I have indicated.
You mentioned some will. Carlyle said, peeking out through the curtains. He looked like a man who had another agenda, perhaps with intent to do violence to this lonesome figure with his cap pulled down to his eyes, sitting in the shadows of the fire.
I think you know what I mean, Mr. Carlyle.
Do I?
I read the papers, I ask around. I have many friends who helps me out now and then.
Who was it? The maid? Holmes held up the silver key and chuckled.
This fits a certain safe in a certain room,
he said. I could see Carlyle recognise the silver key at once. A blackmailer, are you?
I would prefer you think of me as a businessman.
I'll think of you as I like, said Mr. Carlyle, stepping nearer towards Holmes and the fire. My heart was beating hard inside my coat. I felt Holmes was in great danger and hoped we were prepared enough to deal with a man who was already known for violence. How do you know I'm interested? Carlyle said, looking down at Holmes, still seated.
Tell me yourself.
Holmes said, and he held out the long envelope. Carlyle took it and tore it open the seal. He read it and a gleam shone in his eyes. Yes, he said. Yes, this is it.
I thought you'd be pleased.
What do you want? Carlyle turned with a sneer.
I want a little of the joys of the find. I worked hard to get this will for you.
Worked hard? You had a friend, the maid, whoever, sneak it out of the house. You were lucky it was there. What work have you done?
I implemented the idea. I've read about the case. I paid for the girl to act on my behalf. You are robbed of a fortune by a crafty woman marrying your stepfather. I retain that fortune and give it back to you. The date proves this was last written. You have everything.
Again, said Carlyle, moving close to Holmes, I ask you, what is it you want? How much?
I need to know a few things first.
Such as?
If you pushed the old man down the stairs, how do you think you wouldn't get caught? How were you to know there wasn't a servant looking out?
The servants were in bed.
You were so clever. I do admire you. Getting him out of the way like that, knowing you're going to gain so much, and then blaming the lady.
My stepfather was a bumbling idiot most of his life. She was a serpent. I knew her game as soon as I saw her.
So you killed him to get to her?
I got two birds with one stone, you might say. Carlyle was now dangerously close to Holmes, his tall, massive figure towering over him, his shadow blocking out Holmes's figure, till I could only see Holmes's eyes, looking forever upward. I was near breaking point of anxiety. I was not sure where Jacobi was, and I was not sure what Holmes had in planning his escape from this dangerous brute, but I hoped he was armed. Surely, I thought, this is too great a risk. His life was now in real danger. I did not want to lose my friend so horribly, having just made his reacquaintance. Live alone, do you? He said quickly, scanning around the room.
I do,
said Holmes. You're not so very clever, Jacobi, Carlyle said, leaning over Holmes. You should never make business deals alone. Suddenly there was a great rush of movement. Holmes had uncurled from his position and held Carlyle's arm away from his body. I saw a blade flash in the firelight, and then the front door crashed open. I was through the door with my revolver pointed at Carlyle's head, and Jacobi was aiming his pistol in the same direction. As Carlyle looked towards us, two policemen grabbed Carlyle's arm, and the knife fell to the grate before the fire. Carlyle screamed abuse and struggled as hard as he could as the policeman pulled him down to the nearby sofa and held him firm. Still, his legs kicked out. "I'll kill you," he screamed.
It's all over, Carlyle,
Holmes said, recovering and standing up. He flicked a strand of hair from his eyes and breathed heavily, but his eyes shone with success. "Well done, Holmes," I said, and then I heard another familiar voice on the journey into the past. "Holmes," said the man walking through the doorway, "congratulations once more." There, smiling at the scene before him, was Lestrade, older, wiser perhaps, but looking much the same as he always did, with less hair and more lines on his face. "Inspector Lestrade," I said, delighted to see him, particularly in these circumstances. "Chief Inspector now, Dr. Watson," he replied with a smile.
You heard everything?
Holmes said, wiping his face with a handkerchief. "Got it all, Holmes. Well done." "I'll kill you, Carlyle spat as they shook him to his feet.
I think not,
said Holmes, looking directly at Carlyle with contempt.
Bullies and murderers forget one simple fact, which is humanity is basically good. In the end, their crimes catch up with them one way or another.
Holmes picked up the forged will and tossed it into the fire.
A worthless piece of paper, but it did the trick.
Carlyle was ushered out of the room, still struggling, but to no avail. Lestrade watched him go. Nasty piece of work, that one, he said.
Thank you for coming so smartly.
Holmes said. When I got the call, I thought it was a prank, Mr. Holmes. Sherlock Holmes at Baker Street requiring assistance. If it hadn't been Mrs. Hudson and her niece on your instruction, I would have doubted the whole idea. I must say, I'm glad to see you again.
And I'm very glad to see you, Chief Inspector. Very glad.
And the two men shook hands. Well, better get this sorted. As Lestrade turned to go, he said, Staying, are you? Holmes smiled.
For tonight.
Ah, said Lestrade. Pity. We've missed you. We missed you, indeed. Well, so long, Sherlock, Dr. Watson. He walked back down the stairs and Sherlock turned to me.
Well done, Watson. That pistol was aimed in exactly the right place. He stopped what he was doing just enough for those able constables to pounce.
I felt you were in the greatest danger, Holmes. I was very near spoiling the whole thing by coming in too early before you had the confession.
You have a doctor's nerve, Watson. I knew would hold out.
He was over you, Holmes, with a knife. I wasn't sure what you would do.
I had his arm away before he could do damage. Also, I had a backup plan.
Holmes revealed a small pistol tucked into his belt. He placed it on the table.
This is a Derringer, Watson. Very handy for concealment, courtesy of Miss Adler.
I was aware then of Miss Adler standing between the two rooms and looking at Holmes with teary eyes and smiling at the same time. Sherlock, she said, and flew into his arms. Holmes was so taken aback he laughed and had difficulty keeping his balance. Mr. Jacobi collected the revolvers and placed them in a small box. Mr. Jacobi, I said, thank you. I held out my hand. Jacobi took it with a firm handshake, grunted in my direction, and proceeded to put the weapons out of sight. Irene Adler let Holmes go, and they stood facing one another. This really is the last time? Holmes nodded. You came out of retirement for me?
I came out of retirement because a life was in danger and a criminal had to be put away.
You will come and see me? Holmes smiled.
I hope, Miss Adler, you'll be able to sleep now we curtailed the danger. I hope, too, you'll enjoy your years at the Carlyle estate and perhaps settle down to a more sedate life with your next husband.
Irene Adler looked at Holmes and took his hand. I hope so, too, she said. She placed her bonnet on her head. I will try. We shook hands and she made her way to the doorway and stopped. She turned then, and with tears she said simply, Dear Sherlock, we could have been so good, and left. Jacobi followed with the aim of flagging down a cab for her, and Sherlock watched them go from the window. Well, Holmes, that was the most adventurous evening walk I have ever taken.
Dear Watson.
Holmes said, looking greyer now. The reacquaintance with Irene Adler plus the excitement of fending off a ruthless villain must have taken its toll.
It was a most exciting evening, and one that I must admit I shall miss. However, for a longer life, I think my retirement is more suited.
Holmes said, reading my thoughts. He sat opposite, and I was amazed once more, sharing these familiar rooms.
Watson,
Holmes said,
before we part again, shall we partake in some good old-fashioned sherry and a smoke or two?
That would be a great pleasure, I said, and Holmes then gathered the drinks and laid his pipe before him. I lit my cigar, and while we waited for Jacobi to return, we reminisced, and the interval of our separate years fell away, and our conversation flowed as though I had seen Holmes last at the weekend. I felt a great wave of happiness and melancholy as the evening slipped, and then too quickly it was time for goodbye once more. I stood at the doorway.
John.
Sherlock said and smiled. Sherlock, said I, and nodded. We shook hands.
Till next time,
Sherlock said. I smiled, and as I closed the door, I saw Sherlock turn once more to warm his hands by the fire.
The end.